Greetings, students. Again, I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for this course, INR 2002. And what I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to talk about Chapter 2 of our textbook. I've heard from some of the students that they had a little bit of a challenge, especially with Chapter 1 and reading parts of Chapter 2. And what I like to emphasize is that please recall that the first two chapters of the text, like many other textbooks, they're more conceptually oriented. In other words, there is tremendous amount of the discussion of approaches or theories and concepts, and let's face it, those topics are not easy to digest, okay? So the nice thing about it is those chapters are rather brief. There are only a few pages as opposed to 30-40 pages, which was a traditional way for any introduction type of book about international relations. So these are shorter chapters. So I highly recommend that you read them a couple of times. Do not underestimate them. Okay, it is kind of challenging to figure out exactly the big picture that the authors are trying to communicate with you. And again, I like to emphasize that to make the job easier for you, I highlight some of the things that they talk about. It doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with everything they say. Sometimes I play the role of the devil's advocate, present different perspective, because I do not want my students to be, captured by the opinion of one, two, or even three different, political scientists focused on international relations. I think it's very important for a young mind like yours to be exposed to as many ideas as possible. So then that way you make your own decision in terms of what you feel that is more appropriate. And also from an academic perspective, when you hear different point of views, you combine them with some of your own ideas, and who knows, maybe you can come up with some very new ideas, and one day, I don't know, future professors, because I'm going to be, retiring in a few years, future professors would refer to your work as something that has contributed to our field of international relations. Well, having said that one, again, be a little bit patient with the Chapter 2, because still, it's discussing some, as I mentioned, conceptual and theoretical aspect. Now, as you have noticed, each one of the modules, they have provided you with a PowerPoint and chapter summaries and key points and notes and things like that. So I do really recommend that you take a look at them before you watch these videos, and then when you're watching the videos, you see what I'm highlighting, because I'm not going to go and give you a detailed lecture. First of all, that would take at least an hour or something, and then research shows that then we would lose the attention of a lot of students. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the points that I've already mentioned in the PowerPoint and in some of my notes, and then highlight for you what the authors of our text are talking about, and from time to time I also refer to what points that is unique to them, and maybe other political scientists that have different perspectives. So then that way you would hear both sides. All right. First of all, in terms of the summary of this chapter, you need to remember that the chapter is focusing on the development of the concept of international society. That's very important. It's also important to understand what is international society today, and then what has been the challenges to international society. So those are the main points that I can summarize. However, in terms of learning objectives, it's important to know that what do they mean by international society? Okay, and in that regard, we need to also understand how has this international society evolved throughout the history, and what are some of the theoretical approaches to this international society, and last but not least, what are the major challenges? Okay, so the summary, the challenges, and that you need to consider when we are thinking about our learning objectives. Right now, let me highlight some factors for you. The first thing goes under the topic of theoretical approaches to international society, and this is very important that to highlight that the authors, they truly believe that international society developed from Europe by the colonialism and imperialism activity of the Europeans, plus the expansion of what capitalism. That is a very solid perspective that they are presenting, is very clear in that regard. They also mentioned that from the 15th century, the diversity that existed in many of the places that nowadays we call the global south, the concept for that is global south. Sometimes they used to refer to them as, the colonial, entities all over Africa, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. Is that right? There was a diversity over there that because the colonial powers from Europe, they captured these territories and they tried to reinvent them in their own image. Is that right? That type of diversity just went away, Well, nowadays the concept of diversity itself is, under scrutiny and everything. So, but the authors of our, book coming from Great Britain, they have a different perspective on that. So I want you to make sure that you realize what they are saying from their perspective as opposed to what we Americans maybe would be thinking about that. The next major topic right there would be when they're introducing the approach that they have been emphasizing it here and there quite a bit, and that is the English school of thought in international relation. So first they discussed that one in relationship to one of the most dominant theories of IR, which we will talk about this one, in one of the future modules, and that is realism. So they basically say that the English school of international relation came as a reaction to basically realism, which was dominating what the literature of international relation for not just decades, for centuries. Okay, and the emphasis of the English school has basically been by highlighting concepts such as coexistence, cooperation, and conflict. And in that regard, they were hoping to have a better understanding of the relations among sovereign states. Okay. Beyond this one, they also like to emphasize that the English school has tried to focus on concepts such as foreign policy, such as international law, because they wanted to have a better understanding of how to facilitate peaceful relationship among these different actors at the international level. All right, what else are they emphasizing in that regard? We should say that they also have a discussion of two very important concepts, and that these are the notion of course, international society and international system. I don't want to necessarily right now define it because I think it's very important for you to go and look at the exact definition they mentioned, but I want to highlight it that this is one of the things that you should really know, and you should know what's the difference between the two. Is that right? I clarified that one in my notes and also in my PowerPoint, so I want to make sure that you're actually using that one. Beyond that one, the next major concept is what is an international society, and in that regard they go over there and they basically discuss that this is a relationship among states that, if you remember, we basically defined what is a state. They refer to a state which is a political, pretty much, legal apparatus that includes those basically, characteristic we mentioned, which every state has nation, group of people we can call nation. Every state has a territory, is that right? Every state has a government, and that government has to be sovereign. What they really do not add, and here we go, and I added to it, is that the whole notion of diplomatic recognition, is that right? So they emphasize the first four, but the last one, the fifth one I just mentioned, that's very important. Beyond that one, in that same section, if you notice that they refer to the work of a very famous, scholar by the name of, Hedley Ball. If you recall, they mentioned his 1977 work, which pretty much emphasizes their point of view. Is that right? Minus, again, that emphasis on the notion of the diplomatic recognition. So having said that one, it's also important to mention that, generally international society has been stressed as a network, among states, to, interact with one another. And, these are, of course, entities that they do not answer to any higher authority because there is no world government. Is that right? There is not even a regional government. States are what, are, the main authority for themselves. Okay. The next major, topic deals with what are some of the alternative approaches to, to international society. In that regard, if you notice that in that section, they talk about liberal theory, they talk about critical theory, and last but not least, they talk about constructivism. Is that right? So in terms of liberal theory, they believe that the English school has a whole lot in common with them. Why? Because they emphasize the notion of humanitarian intervention, they mention the notion of internationalism, and last but not least, they mention the whole idea about democracy. Then what about the critical theory? In terms of critical theory, as you know, the most significant one has been Marxism. And Marxism has been talking about the conflict at the international level is based on pretty much, the conflict between the rich and poor, is that right? Which is representing two different classes of, states. And they believe that this conflict basically is rooted in the domestic conflict, again, that is associated between class struggles between rich and poor. And last but not least, they're referring to the work of one of the scholars of constructivism. I mentioned the name, the date of her work, is that right? 1996. I'm not going to mention her name because I really want you to go ahead and take a look at the PowerPoint and the notes that I left for you. And the interesting part of it is this particular scholar, she's focusing on what? She's focusing on concepts such as norms, such as state identities, such as, interest. So please recall those. Then the next major issue they have been discussing is the idea of the rise and decline of international society. And then here they go and they talk about, in 19th and 20th century, basically the expansion of Europe had a what? Had a major impact on world politics. Well, that's true because the Europeans, they, started, focusing on all those regions that they were, capturing or controlling, or they were, either politically, economically, militarily. So they brought, they expanded basically the notion of international society, but not necessarily, because remember that international society is among what? Among independent states. Is that right? And, Europeans, they didn't consider the colonies to be equal to them. Okay, within that topic, if you remember, they also mentioned the name of a scholar, O'Higgins. Is that right? They're referring to O'Higgins' work in 2017, so please pay attention to that one. Another important notion is the notion of nationalistic demands, in Europe. And the nationalistic demands also in what? In the European colonies. And that certainly indicates that what? That these nationalistic demand, show that the spread of, European perspective in that regard to lands way beyond Europe was not necessarily always liked by the locals or accepted easily. Okay, the other major topic they focus on is what? The notion of global political unification. Well, in that regard, while in Europe, for all practical purposes, there were nation states. And if you remember in Module 0, I mentioned the difference between states, nation states, multinational states and multi-states nations, all right? So they focus on that one, and that gives it a sense of, okay, even though these states in Europe are different, they're unified in terms of there are some, common cultural views that makes it possible for them to interact with one another. However, those type of things didn't in that format, because of all that differences, is that right, didn't exist in the rest of the world. Okay, so we see that there are different perspectives on that, and associated with that is the notion that there are different sense of identities, cultural identities, different sense of values and norms around the world. So please notice the differences in that regard when they talk about unification. Is that right? It's not like unification of the whole world, okay? Even though the topic seems to suggest that. Please also notice that under a different topic, European division, they refer to what? They refer to, okay, despite the fact that there are some, cultural cultural similarities between many European states, that they were basically Christian, nations for all practical purposes, even if they were from different denominations, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, etc. Is that right? There was tremendous amount of rivalry, okay? Rivalry in terms of the sense of nationalism, like rivalry in the sense of, their expansion and colonial, attitude and imperialistic vision, all right? And here they refer to the work of Brown in 2005, that he sees that actually because of those similarities between many European states, there was pretty much like almost a century of very low level of conflict within Europe from the time that the Napoleonic War ended in 1815 to basically when World War One started in 1914. All right. The next major topic that has been emphasized in this section has been the colonial inequalities. This is again very important to remember that the period between the, basically middle of the 19th century and all the way to the World War One, it was a very intensive period of colonial expansion, and in that regard, Europe did not accept their colonies, as we mentioned, as equal. Okay, so what did it mean when basically World War One finished and then League of Nations was established in 1919? Europeans, they didn't allow many of their colonial entities to become a member because they said they are not ready for it, and they are not equal to us. In fact, some people, they argued that the same thing happened during what? After World War II, by 1945 when United Nations was established. Again, Europeans, they argued something but very, very similar. So the colonial powers argued that these colonies could not join, such international institution until what? Until they win their independence or sovereignty. And guess what? You make that one to be a requirement, then you're basically inviting the whole notion of what? That's not going to happen peacefully. Most likely it's going to happen with what? With some kind of struggle and conflict. All right. Then it comes the other aspect of your chapter that focuses on the notion of what? Decolonization process. So this decolonization process, the high period of it was in 1950s and 60s, right after World War II. Why? Because by this time, European powers, for all practical purposes, have fought one another so much, is that right? That they do not enjoy the same, position of the military strength they used to have, the economic strength they used to have, even the political, level they had. So we see tremendous amount of what, dissatisfaction with the way they were running the colonies, and they cannot stand it, and they are losing some of the most precious colonies they had. For example, for Great Britain, India was the crown of jewel of the crown for all practical purposes. Is that right? And they lose it by 1947, and then we see some similar thing happening in Indonesia with the Dutch, and then in Africa, with, for example, France. Like Algeria, loss of Algeria for France was a very big one, because France considered Algeria not just a colony, but it's a part of the motherland, So these things all happened. And guess what happened right after, these, nations, they got their independence and they became a sovereign state. Right away, they wanted to join the what? United Nations. And of course, there was understanding that if these countries, they want to join United Nations, there has to be a what? There has to be some what? Some basically requirements. And the requirement would be that they would accept the principles that United Nations has, the values it has, basically in terms of human rights, in terms of the liberal democracy. So that was very important. And we see that after basically World War II, a balance of power starts developing a new balance of power, and this balance of power is not the traditional balance of power in what? That was based in Europe, okay? It was from two states that they were, in the periphery area of, Europe. We have Soviet Union in far east, is that right? And then we have United States of America coming from a completely different continent, is that right? And here we see the rivalry between those two, which are, very powerful, not only military and economically, politically, ideologically, is that right? So there is a bipolarity going. Now, the next topic is the challenges to international society in the 21st century, and that is also a very, very important topic. And here they're talking about the whole notion of, they refer, if you remember, they refer to the work of, Brown, who was referring to the idea that there was a relative peace going on in Europe for almost a century. And they said, well, guess what? The conditions that Brown was talking about in the post-World War II period, it was neither satisfactory or appropriate. So it doesn't work. Is that right? And then they say that as the number of the new states increases, and the total number of states in the world was roughly about 200, not exactly, but 200 is a good number to remember. It's a nice round number. Is that right? Again, the problem was that many of these states, they were neither European or Western. You see? So again, it seems like, the game is changing. The rules of the game is changing, and we need to keep up with that. And then, so nowadays we see that the European, for example, actually even, values and identities and everything itself is in a process of some changes with whole notion of immigration and everything else. Then, if you notice, they're also referring to a new concept. Is that right? They say that if, for example, international society is not an appropriate concept anymore, so a lot of them, they started talking about something called international community, is that right? Which is more looser, and a more flexible concept. And then it would include a lot of these. Like example of that would be the work of Schmidt in 2015, okay? So international community has that more vague phase that involves, actually theories from geopolitics and international relation, and it deals with, for example, pursuing broad aims like liberal democracy and human rights. Okay, and of course both of them are what? Subject to interpretation, as you can see. So there is no one notion right there. Then after that, they refer to the whole notion of the New World Order and disorder. Well, as you know, right after the demise of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, there were people like, George Bush Sr. Was referring to the whole new world order. Is that right? A lot of, so he was a policymaker, but also this notion was also, advocated by a number of different, basically political scientists and people who focus on international relations. And associated with that one, then there were a couple of other ideas that come about. One of it, which was championed by Samuel Huntington in 1996, very, very powerful one came about, was called a clash of what? Civilization. And the whole notion that, well, yes, there is no more Soviet Union, but what is left over in the world is in struggle against each other based on their what? Based on their religious and ethnic and whatever identities, and defined in terms of civilization. Of course, the work of Huntington, the late Professor Huntington, has been what? Has been challenged by a number of other people. I used to have actually his book as one of the books that I cover when I teach this course. Nowadays, we include bits and pieces of it here and there because there are also a very interesting debate about what he was talking about and how much of it is accurate and how much of it is not. All right. Then we see also the ideas that people like Troy has presented in in 2012, better to say, about the clash of civilization, how this notion has come out after something like the hegemonic bipolarity that existed. Then there is also the highlight on the three other mini subjects, and one is the new and old conflict. Well, in international relation, there has always been conflict, the same way there has been cooperation. Sometimes, many times actually, conflict catches the headlines a lot more. But the whole notion right here has there been a really new world order, or has it been the old order basically played in different ways? So I want you to really look at that section of the chapter very carefully and see what it's talking about, because again it comes back to the notion of clash of civilization and the impact that has had, and is this something really new? Because if the new world order didn't really work, then there was like a return to, as some people have suggested, return to the struggle between different nationalities and religious, perspectives and everything else, which is, the topic that basically Clash of Civilization was talking about. Is that right? So I'm not saying that it's correct, and I'm not saying it's, inaccurate. I just want to make sure that you're open to see both sides. Is that right? Because we can argue it in different ways. Then there is also this characteristic of this new international order, or maybe it's a new international disorder, as your authors are talking about. Is that right? And based on that, the existence of an international society, which was once reflected in certain, values and standards and everything else, it becomes kind of problematic. Is that right? So they are referring to the whole notion that a lot of these new members of this international community, I guess, for lack of a better term, is that right? They reject the old, dichotomy that the Europeans were talking about, the civilized nations versus the barbarians. Well, were the Europeans the first one? Then they started talking about that. When we go through ancient history, and that's one of the weakest part of their, book, is that we look at the Greeks and Romans, and when they were fighting with the Asians and Africans, that's what they used to refer to. Now they're fighting Africans, and here we go, Egypt. You can't call Egypt necessarily barbarian society, is that right? They've had accomplishment a lot more than some other countries. When you're fighting against the Persian Empire or the Chinese or here or there, or whatever, but this is how basically the politics has gone, and there was a return of it with the Europeans, expanding their power throughout what nowadays we call global South in Asia, Africa, etc. The last but not least topic that I like to highlight is the whole notion of the end of the international society. Is that right? So we say that after the Cold War, a new world order did not fully develop following the demise of the USSR, and that's a very true thing. Is that right? So international society was a little more than a fantasy for some people. Is that right? And this, how do we know? We know that because there's tremendous amount of dichotomies and differences in terms of very, very important notions. Notions like human rights, notion of what's a political community, notion of economic strategy, notion of the approaches to environmental issues and crises, and also concerns about disadvantage, characteristic or lasting disadvantages that certain places have as opposed to others. In terms of what? In terms of gender issues, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of business and economy and everything. So this is basically, what chapter 2 is talking about. And of course, I would really like you to, as I mentioned, you really review chapter 1 and 2 very, very carefully. And when you have questions, as always, you send me a message, and I would be glad to what? To answer it. Have a good one.